There is something special about a game that can keep the player on the edge of their seat with a beating heart and sweaty palms. Crafting tense experiences is difficult in any artistic medium, but crafting tension in an interactive system presents some interesting opportunities and challenges unique to games. Today, I want to explore how games evoke tension through gameplay, and how their unique attributes set them apart from other media. But before that, we need to define what I mean by tension. For the purposes of this video, I will be using the definition of tension provided by psychologists Moritz Lehn and Stefan Kolsch. In their paper, Towards a General Psychological Model of Tension and Suspense, Lehn and Kolsch define tension as affective states that are associated with conflict, dissonance, instability, or uncertainty, create a yearning for resolution, concern events of potential emotional significance, and build on future-directed processes of expectation, anticipation, and prediction. Each of the elements presented in this definition are essential to creating a tense experience for the player. Uncertainty is essential for creating tension. It's fortunate, then, that uncertainty is an essential part of games. In Rules of Play, Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman point out that every game needs an element of uncertainty to create meaningful play. For an example of a game without uncertainty, look at tic-tac-toe. The entire game revolves around the question of who will win the game. This question is at the heart of every multiplayer game, but when two competent adults play tic-tac-toe, the answer to this question is so obvious you don't even need to play the game to know the outcome. There is nothing the players can do to change the fact that the game will end in a draw, and thus their actions will feel meaningless. In better games, it is a lot harder to predict the outcome for certain, which makes the player's actions feel meaningful. It is this fundamental property of games that makes them great at generating tense experiences. While the question of who will win is in almost every game, games also get the player to ask several smaller questions about who, what, when, where, and how the game will play out. Who will lose a stock first? What is behind this door? When will we capture the point? Where are the terrorists? How will my opponent approach our goal? Generating questions in the player's head is not the hard part. The hard part is making those questions tense, which requires more than pure uncertainty. These games require anticipation. Humans make predictions all the time, and this makes a lot of sense. If you can look at a situation and predict that hunting a lion with your bare hands will not end well, you will be more likely to pass your genes to future generations. Making predictions is a skill that has been hardwired into our behavior over the course of generations. The modern human makes so many predictions that we even make predictions about fantasy worlds that don't directly give us a survival advantage. However, it is impossible for us to make predictions without information. Imagine two people sitting at a table talking. Suddenly, bang! A bomb explodes and they're blown to smithereens. Sure, this scene might be surprising, but it isn't really suspenseful, because the viewer had no reason to believe the bomb would go off in such a normal situation, and thus there is no anticipation. Now imagine this scene again, but this time you can see the bomb sitting under the table with a timer counting down. This scene will be much more tense than the first, because the additional information allows the viewer to anticipate some future outcome, and wonder if the people will notice the bomb before it is too late. As important as information is to building tension, it is important not to give the player too much information. If the audience has too much information, there will be no uncertainty, which kills the scene's chance to build tension. A game's possibility space will also have an effect on how tense a scene will be. The possibility space describes every possible combination of player actions and game states provided by the game's rules. While there will be a lot of variation in these game states, at least in a game with a lot of depth, you could put each of these game states onto a spectrum. On one end, you have the game states that the player hopes to achieve, and on the other end, you have the outcomes that the player fears. A tense game is able to keep the player on a knife's edge, where either outcome is equally likely. It's also important to know that the more the player hopes for their best case scenario, and the more they fear their worst-case scenario, the more tension they will feel. Compare a death in Super Meat Boy to a death in Spelunky. In Super Meat Boy, the player doesn't lose much when they die. Each screen can be cleared in less than a minute, so the player only loses a couple seconds with each death. Compare this to Spelunky, where each death sends the player back to the start of the game, to run through a completely new set of levels. The way each of these games utilize death means that I generally find Spelunky to be a more tense game, because there is more on the line at any particular time. Feedback loops can also be used to enhance or undermine tension. A feedback loop is a system where the output is fed back into the system as an input. There are two kinds of feedback loops. A positive feedback loop amplifies the current state of the system, so that it grows exponentially. Chess is a good example of a game with a very strong positive feedback loop. If a player loses a piece, they now have less options available to attack, defend, and generally control the board. Once a player gets ahead in chess, their stronger position will generally snowball into an even better position until they eventually win the game. Positive feedback loops have their advantages, but creating tension is not one of those advantages. Positive feedback loops make certain outcomes more likely, thus reducing uncertainty and making it too easy for the player to predict the outcome of the match. It's not all that uncommon for high-level chess players to resign several moves before they're actually checkmated, because they know that there's nothing they can do to prevent their fate. In other words, their fate is certain, and thus, tension is destroyed. However, not all feedback loops undermine tension. Negative feedback loops are the exact opposite of positive feedback loops. Instead of amplifying the current state of the system, negative feedback loops inhibit changes in the system to maintain a homeostatic state. As an example, think about the blue shell in Mario Kart, which targets the player in the lead and is typically used by the players in the back. This power-up prevents any player from getting too far ahead of the pack and gives a helping hand to the players who fall behind. Players are generally much closer in games with negative feedback. Comebacks are a distinct possibility, in which players are on the edge of their seat, wondering if they can pull this match back and claim a victory. By reducing positive feedback loops and introducing negative feedback loops, designers can keep players on the edge of their seats for longer. Tension can also be viewed through the lens of flow theory. When the player is presented with a challenge that is neither too hard nor too easy in comparison to their skill level, there will be more uncertainty about the outcome. If a chess grandmaster played a game against a normal child, both players would know the outcome, and neither player would be in flow. The grandmaster wouldn't be challenged by the child, and would slide into boredom. Meanwhile, the child would be filled with anxiety because their opponent is too hard for them to overcome. However, if that grandmaster plays another grandmaster, there will be much more tension, since both players are evenly matched, and it will be much harder to predict the outcome. This example also shows that a game's tension will vary wildly based on the context of play and the past experiences of the players. Even though developers don't have complete control over how players play their games, there are many things that they can do to make sure that the challenge presented to the player will keep them in flow. Many multiplayer games use matchmaking to put you up against players of roughly equivalent skill level. Supergiant Games is a company that has a brilliant approach when it comes to difficulty design. In Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, there are systems in place that allow the player to increase the difficulty of encounters in exchange for more experience points. Since these systems are completely optional, it allows players of many different skill levels to enter into flow, and it keeps fights closer, and thus more tense. If you want more information about putting the player into a flow state, I would recommend checking out my video on Luftrausers, which covers this topic in more detail. All of this is well and good, but it is hard to build tension without creating an emotional connection to the outcome. This is where the methods of creating tension diverge significantly, since players will develop emotional investment into different things and in different ways. I don't really watch football, so the Super Bowl is not all that tense to me. However, the Super Bowl is the peak of the football season for millions of players, and can keep people on the edge of their seat until the last second of the game. This is not necessarily the Super Bowl's fault. and criticizing it for not being a tense experience to me isn't exactly fair. In the same way, many of the people who watch the Super Bowl aren't invested into competitive Smash Brothers and will not find high-level fighting game tournaments as tense as I do. That said, there are a lot of ways that games can get players emotionally invested in their outcome, and none of them can objectively claim to be the best for everyone. Some developers create emotional investment with compelling writing and character development. Other games tap into our psychology to achieve the same effect through mechanical means. One example of this is the psychological concept of scarcity, which says that people will value a resource that is limited more than an abundant resource. Games use this to their advantage all the time. The End Is Nigh has a section where the player needs to make it through a tough-as-nails platforming gauntlet with a finite number of lives. Into the Breach only gives you one reset every mission, so the player needs to use it carefully. The entire roguelike genre revolves around this concept of scarcity, since the player is only given one opportunity to get through any particular set of levels. This scarcity doesn't even need to be real. The player only needs to think it is real. Hellblade lied to its players, telling them that if they died too many times, their save would be thrown out and they would need to start the game anew. This created a tense moment after every death, where the player wondered if this was the time that their save would be deleted. Of course, this was a lie, and the player's save was never actually deleted, but it still created the effect regardless. Sometimes game communities can inject scarcity into a game that doesn't normally feature it as much, and was not put there by the designer. For instance, Smash Bros. Normally doesn't have much scarcity, since you can just rematch your opponent and play again. However, in a competitive setting like EVO, if you lose too many times, you are eliminated from the tournament, making a tense experience for both the player and the audience. Loss aversion can also emotionally invest the player into mechanics, by threatening to take away something from the player. In Team Fortress 2, losing a match isn't a huge deal, since you aren't punished in any way for a loss. Compare that to a game like Rocket League, where a loss can send you to a lower, less prestigious rank. I have a whole video talking about this psychological concept, and I recommend checking it out if you want more details. All of these elements come together to create tension. Games create an uncertain outcome where the player makes predictions about that outcome. If there isn't enough information to make predictions, the tension will be absent. At the same time, providing too much information will remove uncertainty, which is a vital element in tension. Because of their interactive nature, games have methods of creating tension not found in other mediums. Games can use procedural generation to produce a new experience each time the player plays. Loss aversion and scarcity are much easier to introduce in an interactive setting. Movies and books cannot use feedback loops. Ultimately, this video only scratches the surface of the potential that games have to reliably create tense experiences. If I covered everything a game could do to introduce tension, I would be here for a very, very long time. I hope that these guidelines can help you identify tension in the wild, and understand how games can craft systems where tension tends to emerge for most players. I would love to hear your thoughts about what games you find tense. If you have an example of a creative or weird or interesting game system that produces tension, tell me about it in the comments. I also want to give a special shout out to K-Bash, who provided the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate footage that you saw a couple times throughout the video. I don't have a capture card, so I'm not able to get Switch footage myself. Go subscribe to K-Bash. He talks about fighting games and weird anime games. I'm not into anime, but fighting games are cool. Go check him out. This has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.